Hey, welcome back, Screen Crush. I'm Ryan Airy, and I think that we might have all misunderstood the meaning of the prequel trilogy. Yes, the Star Wars prequels are about the fall of democracy, corruption, tragic love, but I think that first and foremost, they are a meditation on George Lucas's divorce.
Now, do you say what now?
That's right. I'm going to explain how The Phantom Menace, Attack of the Clones, and Revenge of the Sith are how George Lucas dealt with a kind of midlife crisis. Or maybe midlife crisis is too harsh. Let's go with midlife reflection. But before we get rolling, I want to thank all of you guys for watching, supporting our channel, and for shopping at our merch store where we make all the merch ourselves. We have created this brand new Star Wars inspired parody merch that I am so proud of. We have this Twin Sunset Always shirt inspired by my favorite scene from the franchise, the You Were My Brother shirt documenting the tragic brothers of the saga, Good Soldiers Follow Orders, Somehow Palpatine Returned, Original Trilogy, Prequel Apologist, Thank You George, Din and Grogu as E.T. and Elliot. You can find the links for all of these below. Thank you guys for watching. Now, I know everybody always craps on the prequels.
I don't like sand.
But I do actually think there's a hidden movies in those meanings that no one ever talks about. You see, every film George Lucas makes is personal to George Lucas, and you can't really understand Star Wars unless you understand the man George Lucas himself. Now, I have to recommend this excellent book, George Lucas Alive by Brian J. It was indispensable research for this video. So, let's talk about George. George Lucas is my hero. No creator has done more to influence my life. I think it's a tragedy that Marvel fans tend to canonize Stan Lee with cameos and tributes.
Are you Tony's stank?
But George Lucas is treated like the embarrassing uncle of Star Wars.
Yeah, but that's because he made the prequels, and everybody knows the prequels are really bad.
Well, look, we're not here to talk about the quality of the prequels. I want to discuss the meaning of the prequels. In George Lucas's 50-year career, he's only directed 6 films, and each of those films were autobiographical in some way. His first trilogy of films, THX 1138, American Graffiti, and Star Wars, all deal with the same theme, escape. And when you learn about his early life, it's obvious that each of these movies was, in some way, about young George Lucas. Lucas was raised in Modesto, California. Now, Modesto is not a small town. At about 200,000 people, it's currently the 19th largest city in California. But young Lucas seems to have thought that the town was kind of a dead end.
If there's a bright center to the universe, you're on the planet that it's farthest from.
Geez, George, my hometown's so small we celebrate the anniversary of when Hall & Oates drove through in 1984. Anyways, Lucas felt very stifled in his early home life. His dad owned a stationery store, and he expected George to follow in his footsteps, selling office supplies. Now, by George's own admission, they fought often, and he even told his dad that he would never be a businessman.
Swore to my father was a businessman, that I would never, ever, ever be a businessman.
It's easy to see how George's taciturn father was represented by Uncle Owen in A New Hope, especially in the way he tries to limit his son's ambitions.
You can waste time with your friends when your chores are done. Now, come on, get to it.
Hell, Lucas even tried joining the Air Force Academy in 1967, but was turned down because he had too many speeding tickets. Now, because of Lucas's strained relationship with his father, all throughout his young life, he sought out mentor figures. Growing up, Lucas had a few interests that are probably not hard to guess. He loved cars and rebuilding engines. He loved science fiction, books like Dune, and comic books like Don Rosa's Scrooge McDuck. And he loved TV, movies, and Saturday serials like Flash Gordon.
Yeah, but that's not new information. You can find that out in any interview with George Lucas.
Yes, but what's more important to me is why he was drawn to this kind of media. Lucas wanted to escape. He loved cars because cars get you the hell out of your hometown real fast. He loved movies and TV because they're a form of escapism. And creating art is a way of escaping your surroundings into a pocket world that you've created for yourself. After Lucas famously nearly died in a car accident, he got serious with his life and went to film school at USC. Now, this is in the late 1960s, and at this time, film school was not a great way to break into the movie industry. Old Hollywood ran union apprenticeships, so the only way to break into the pictures is if you knew someone. Film schools mostly turned out people who ended up making educational films or documentary directors, and that's if you were lucky. But Lucas's contemporaries at USC saw themselves as revolutionaries. They dubbed themselves the USC Dirty Dozen. His classmates included Walter Murch and John Milius, the writer of Apocalypse Now, and he was also the basis for this guy.
You're entering a world of pain.
I should also note that Lucas was an incredibly visionary student. He made these art films that blew everyone away, particularly with his prowess as an editor. And during this time, Lucas did get an in to the film industry. He was allowed to visit the set of Finian's Rainbow and shadow the director, one Francis Ford Coppola, who of course directed this.
Lost my visual. What's going on?
And also more famously, this.
I'm gonna make him an offer he can't refuse.
Coppola, like Lucas, wanted to tear down the Hollywood system, and so he took young George under his wing. Finally, Lucas had that mentor figure that he was searching for years. Coppola founded a new company for hungry young filmmakers called American Zoetrope, and their first film would be a big-budget adaptation of George Lucas's experimental short THX 1138. And guys, don't worry, all of this is laying the groundwork for why I think the prequel trilogy was about George Lucas coping with his midlife crisis and his divorce. So, the theme of Lucas's first trilogy, like I said, was escape. Now, I know you've seen Star Wars, so I'm briefly going to talk about THX 1138 and American Graffiti, because I want you to see how personal these films were to George Lucas, so you can understand why the prequels were so important to George when he was in his 50s. Now, THX 1138 really is the best and worst of George Lucas with nothing in between. We have his most stilted dialogue ever.
What's this? Why did you change it?
You've seen enough.
You know I don't feel well.
But we also have stunning visuals that implied a larger world just on the edges of the frame. So, the plot of THX is that Robert Duvall and the other humans are living in this vast underground complex building machines. We never actually see who they work for, but it's implied that they are working for other machines. The humans are so drugged up they don't feel emotions or sexual desires, and the people are controlled with religion.
Remember, substitution of Enerval for atrazine may cause a serious chemical.
At night, they watch meaningless programs on TV, and Robert Duvall gets stimulated by a robot, an idea which, by the way, Lucas revisited with Chewbacca's dad in the Star Wars Holiday Special.
Oh, it's kind of hard to explain. It's a, wow.
I'm getting your message. Are you getting mine?
Essentially, everything that makes us human, love, passion, art, the soul, are suppressed and repackaged as a manner of control. The ideas in the film are phenomenal and steeped in the counterculture of the 1960s, and the movie is also very, very, very boring. However, some sequences, like this walk through an endless void prison, are stunning. I'm also a big fan of the end chase sequence where the machines just let Robert Duvall go because it's too expensive to keep chasing him. So in this, we're seeing that Lucas's sense of freedom was tied directly to money. He even told his father when he left home that he would be a millionaire before he turned 30. For George, being a successful artist meant financial independence, in a way also to prove himself to his father. So, THX 1138 bombed, and the failure sank American Zoetrope and strained George's relationship with Francis. Lucas also resented the studio for taking the film away from him and recutting it. And we're going to see this resentment toward the studio system come back again and again and again. But shortly before making THX, George met and married Marcia Griffin, who became Marcia Lucas. Now, Marcia was an amazing film editor in her own right. She was Scorsese's director of choice, cutting New York, New York, Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, and of course, this.
You talking to me? You talking to me?
George and Marcia complemented each other kind of well. He was cold and distant, but she was the heart and emotion. After THX bombed, she encouraged him to tell a personal story with heart. So he made American Graffiti.
5, 6, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, rock.
Now today we think of Lucas as a success because of Star Wars, but really it was American Graffiti that made Lucas a star. And American Graffiti might be the most personal blockbuster film ever made. It takes place in the last night of summer in a small town in 1963, and it follows the story of 4 young men. George Lucas later said that the 4 main characters represent himself at 4 different points in his life. There's Toad, who is George at his nerdiest.
I'll love and protect this car until death do us part.
Kurt is the young man who's dying to get out of his hometown. Steve is the kid who says he wants to leave but is drawn to stay with his girlfriend. And then there's John Milner, the gearhead greaser with a yellow hot rod, the fastest ride in town. It's easy to see a parallel here with Han Solo, but also with young Lucas himself, who also drove a souped-up yellow hot rod. The movie even ends with a car crash, like the near-death experience that essentially ended Lucas's childhood. Now, I'm telling you all of this so that you understand that every single story that George Lucas tells is personal to him in some way, especially Star Wars. Star Wars is about a kid from a small town who dreams of doing big things. He has Lucas's last name and has a taciturn father figure who wants him to stay in the family business. After the young man meets an alternate mentor figure, he joins a group of rebels who want to take down the Empire or the Hollywood establishment. And of course, there's also a lot of political allegory, with Lucas in later years admitting that the rebels were based in part on the Viet Cong.
The good guys are the rebels. I think we call those guys terrorists.
When I did it, they were Viet Cong.
So, Star Wars, of course, is a massive hit, earning Marcia Lucas a shared Oscar for co-editing the movie with Richard Chew and the great Paul Hirsch. And this is where it gets interesting. What comes after Happily Ever After? What does Lucas do when all his dreams come true? Well, for starters, he resented the studio for shortchanging him on money for Star Wars' VFX. So, he negotiated to win all franchise and merchandising rights to Star Wars. And then, he used his percentages of the Star Wars Wars gross to build his own studio system. He founded Industrial Light and Magic, THX Sound, Skywalker Sound, then eventually LucasArts, Pixar, and a host of other companies. Rather than work out of Hollywood, he built up a film complex at his house called Skywalker Ranch outside of San Francisco. He wanted to realize the dream of American Zoetrope, to create a self-contained haven for filmmakers like himself and Marcia. Marcia, though, wanted to start a family, but George put all of that off, wanting to build more, to have more control. He told Marcia, just wait, we're building something here where you'll be able to edit whatever you want. It'll be state of the art. Now, I should also note that around this time, Lucas had one of his many fallings out with Francis Ford Coppola. Among other reasons, he resented Francis for getting percentage points of the Star Wars gross. Coppola also directed Apocalypse Now, which Lucas had been trying to direct since he attended college with John Milius. Also, allegedly, Coppola hit on Lucas's wife.
Oh dear.
Slowly, Lucas was becoming a businessman like his dad. But what's interesting is, during this period, he's working on The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, when the story's focus starts to move away from Luke and onto the father, Darth Vader.
I've accepted the truth that you were once Anakin Skywalker, my father.
It is too late for me, son.
Lucas conceived of a scene where a rebellious young teenager actually sees a vision of himself turning into his dad. That hits really close to home. But George's desire for control and throwing himself into his work drove a wedge between him and Marcia. She, kind of ironically, had an affair with the guy installing stained glass windows at the ranch. So they divorced, George got custody of their kid, and then he adopted more kids. It turns out that George loved being a father, and he entered a semi-retirement to spend the 80s being a good dad and dating Linda Ronstadt. So, George's first trilogy, the one he directed, was about escape. In his second trilogy, which he produced, and I'm talking about Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi, and Willow, these films are all about building a new kingdom. And throughout the 1980s, that's just what George did. He built a filmmaking empire that propelled the industry forward. Essentially, many of the technical innovations we think of in film, not just CGI, but standardized sound, all of that comes from George Lucas. But George couldn't stop thinking about Star Wars. He had a new story to tell, the fall of Anakin Skywalker and the rise of the Empire. But remember, at this point, George Lucas does not need the money. He could make whatever kind of artsy tone poem film that he wanted, but he had something personal to say with his prequel trilogy. I think he wanted to create a trilogy of movies that reflected his entire life story. Now, the overall story of the prequels was exactly what we expected. The original novelization of Star Wars said that the Old Republic fell because of corrupted financial interests from within, like the Roman Empire did. But Lucas mapped this historical fall over a story that was personal to him. So, this is the third George Lucas trilogy. But now, his proxy is not a young man wanting to break free. His proxy is the corrupted father, Darth Vader. So let's take everything we've just learned about George Lucas's past and map it over the prequel trilogy. In The Phantom Menace, little Anakin is a proxy for young, innocent George Lucas. He's a boy who dreams of bigger worlds.
I'm a pilot, you know, and someday I'm gonna fly away from this place.
He loves drag racing. He's searching for a mentor figure. He has a father figure who forces him to work in the family business against his will.
The boy's good, no doubts there, huh?
But more importantly, in The Phantom Menace, Anakin is a side character. He's an observer. He watches in wonder at all these adventures playing out around him. Samurai space operas, valiant heroes, galactic politics, wars. And this is much like how a young child George Lucas observed samurai films and space operas on TV and at the movies.
I had a dream I was a Jedi. I came back here and freed all the slaves.
You can look at The Phantom Menace and see influences from the early life of George Lucas, trying to escape an oppressive robot regime, just like in THX. Jar Jar's duck-billed face is similar to Scrooge McDuck, Lucas's all-time favorite comic from his childhood. The movie is a summary of George Lucas's early life and also the events of the first trilogy. The climax of the first movie even combines elements from the Death Star run in A New Hope, the climactic saber battle of Empire, and the ground battle in Jedi. It's like Lucas is summing up all of the original trilogy and his childhood in one film. It's like the movie is summarizing George Lucas up to this point. And once we move past that prologue, the focus shifts to George Lucas in his 50s.
Yeah, I don't know, man. This is seeming like you're kind of reaching.
No, dude, think about it. Lucas intentionally made Anakin a child in this movie. He could have had Vader father his kids when he was in his 40s, but instead, he wanted to tell a story about a young man making mistakes. Attack of the Clones is when the focus finally shifts to Anakin. It's when the overall story is about adult George Lucas and the mistakes that he made. Anakin's story is about George Lucas looking back on his life with regret. I mean, think about it. We have a young man from the middle of nowhere who loves driving fast. This boy's always seeking out mentor figures because he doesn't want to be stuck in the family business. He goes away to join a special school where he quickly excels to show that he is the best of his peers. But he resents the control of this governing body. He meets a brown-haired professional woman who is at the top of her game. Not to mention, Natalie Portman kind of looks like Marcia Lucas. There's even a brotherly mentor figure who he develops an adversarial relationship with.
It's all Obi-Wan's fault.
He's jealous. He's holding me back.
And I think George Lucas might have also felt like he advanced beyond his mentor figure Francis Ford Coppola. Lucas became a billionaire while Francis bankrupted himself funding his opus One from the Heart.
In some ways, a lot of ways, I'm really ahead of him.
Now, I'm not saying that every single character and event in the prequels has a real-world analogy, but I wouldn't be surprised if Lucas got sage advice from a fry cook once. But look guys, writers write what they know. Any story a writer creates is going to be informed by his own life experience. Hell, Lucas literally put himself and his kids in Revenge of the Sith. I think Attack of the Clones is about George Lucas's life after the release of Star Wars: A New Hope, when he transitioned away from being a director and became a producer and an entrepreneur.
King George never made another film after that. Instead, he became, a producer and an entrepreneur.
The movie is about Anakin falling in love with Padme. And again, if George Lucas is always writing from his personal experience, then I have to think that Anakin's relationship is based on the way George felt about Marcia. You can even see parallels in the world and galactic events that are unfolding. When George and Marcia met in the late 60s, the war in Vietnam meant that the specter of a draft was hanging over their entire generation. And Attack of the Clones begins with Padme opposing a bill to draft people into the public service. Now, Attack of the Clones ends with an arrival of the clones in a big action spectacle. Now, many fans like myself always assumed that the clones in the Clone Wars would have been the bad guys. But the thing is, they do become the villains. The clones could be read as a metaphor for the Hollywood that arrived after Star Wars. In the 60s and 70s, studios turned to auteurs like Lucas and Coppola and Spielberg to save the business. But following the disastrous bombs like Michael Cimino's Heaven's Gate, Hollywood slowly embraced sequels and blockbusters, creating the barren landscape of cinema and streaming that we know today. We've seen endless attempts to clone the success of A New Hope, followed by endless attempts to clone the success of an interconnected saga.
I don't know, man. Are you saying everything in the movies is a metaphor for George Lucas's life?
Not necessarily, but I do think that Anakin Skywalker and Padme's relationship is 100% a metaphor for George Lucas's divorce. Lucas writes what he knows, and when he wrote the prequels, his divorce was barely 10 years old. He hadn't remarried yet. The failure of his marriage was on his mind. So let me run you through Revenge of the Sith, the first and only movie where Anakin is the only main character. And this is truly the movie that is about George Lucas's life post-Star Wars. The movie begins with Anakin and Padme married, but Anakin is consumed by fear. He doesn't want to lose what he has. He wants to win the war. He wants to keep his family safe. In the Attack of the Clones audio commentary, he describes Anakin's arc in a strange way.
He's greedy in that he wants to keep his mother around. He's greedy in that he wants to become more powerful in order to control things, in order to keep the things around that he wants.
It's interesting that Lucas says Anakin is obsessed with things and keeping things, when Anakin's not obsessed with keeping things. He's obsessed with keeping Padme safe, but George Lucas was the one who was obsessed with keeping things. Anakin thought he was turning to the dark side for Padme, but actually, he was turning for himself. He wanted to feel in control, to redeem his own failure of letting his mother die, just as Lucas, in building his empire, was trying to overcome the humiliation of THX 1138's failure.
I will be the most powerful Jedi ever.
Anakin's resentment of the Jedi Council is an allegory for Lucas's resentment of the Hollywood system.
What kind of nonsense is this? Put me on the council and not make me a master? It's never been done in the history of the Jedi. It's insulting.
He wanted to create a bubble for himself where the Hollywood money people could never reach him. He wanted control, and he told himself this beautiful lie, that he was doing it all for Marcia, for their future family. He talked to her about building a state-of-the-art edit suite. But what was really happening was that Lucas was too focused on his career, and his coldness was driving away his wife.
You're breaking my heart.
Just as Anakin is searching for control, and this leads him to the dark side. He has chosen his work over his wife.
You're going down a path I can't follow.
Marcia ended up wanting out of the marriage because George was a workaholic. He was too focused on building his new empire.
The only reason it's fun is because I don't have to answer to anybody. I don't have anybody telling me what to do. I make it, and then I turn around and sell it.
Does that sound familiar?
I have brought peace, freedom, justice, and security to my new empire.
Yeah, but what does Marcia think about all this?
Well, neither Marcia nor Lucas comment on their relationship much, but we do know what she thought of the prequels. And I should note here that Marcia was also a key figure in shaping early Star Wars, especially in the edit room, and making sure that her husband's film hit the right emotional beats instead of repeating the emotionless mistakes of THX 1138. After seeing The Phantom Menace, Marcia criticized the age gap between Anakin and Padme. She said that by making Padme older, she became an object of desire that Anakin can never actually relate to as an equal, just like how George Lucas's emotional barriers prevented him from connecting to Marcia. Anakin put Padme on a pedestal so he could never relate to her as a real person. In the same way that Anakin was pulled in by the lore of the dark side, George was pulled into the life of a mogul and then became trapped in that role. While Anakin was pulled into his empire and trapped in a robot suit, Lucas became part machine, the Hollywood machine.
We were deprived of those films that he was going to make and might have made. And instead we have an enormous, kind of industrial marketing complex.
And I even think that Lucas might have seen himself as a kind of chosen one of New Hollywood. He was the clear standout among his peers at USC. He was the one with the creative vision to recreate Hollywood, to standardize sound and to create giant leaps forward in visual effects. Just as Anakin was destined to destroy the Sith, Lucas was destined to break the Hollywood system, a corrupt system where creative decisions were made by businessmen and bankers.
The system is designed really to tear you down and destroy everything that you're doing and push it off to the side.
But instead, George Lucas became an integral part of that system. Star Wars became Lucas's prison. And the Republic, the shining potential of New Hollywood, ended up using the youthful talent of George Lucas / Anakin to become a blockbuster empire. And then, in 2012, Lucas literally sold out to them and immediately regretted it.
I sold them to the white slavers that take these things and
But in some ways, selling Lucasfilm to Disney was like Vader destroying the Emperor. Lucas finally freed himself from Star Wars, just as Anakin freed himself from the dark side. Now, the prequels obviously contain several story beats that are in the original trilogy. Lucas is famous for justifying his repeated story beats by saying,
yeah, it's like poetry, so if they rhyme.
But really, he's saying that we're all doomed to repeat history if we don't learn from it. At their heart, the prequels are about a young man who has good intentions, but ends up becoming trapped, just like how George Lucas wanted to escape the life of his businessman father, only to become his businessman father. I should also note that George Lucas did find love again. He married his current wife in 2013, they adopted a child, and he appears to be a very happy man. But guys, we will never see anything like this again. This is a film franchise that has earned billions and billions and billions of dollars, and it was born as the personal expression of one man, first processing his childhood and then grappling with middle age. Today, blockbusters are mostly devoid of any personal statement about an artist's life. Giant robots slap each other around, Vin Diesel jumps over something huge, comic book characters shoot energy out of their hands, and look, I like all of those movies. They're a lot of fun, but George Lucas's Star Wars might be the last time we see a major blockbuster franchise that is a personal statement about one man's life, how he sees the world, and his warning about how we can become trapped in our own personal Darth Vader suits if we don't learn from his mistakes. Well guys, that's just my thoughts on the hidden meaning of the prequel trilogy. Do you think I'm wrong? Do you think I'm full of it? Let me know in the comments below or at me on Twitter. And if it's your first time here, please subscribe, smash that bell for alerts. For Screen Crush, I'm Ryan Airy.